I'm 26 years old, and I've been into landscape photography for about 5 years now. It started as a hobby during college, but lately I've been trying to sell prints and maybe turn it into a full-time thing. Because of that, I tend to go out to pretty remote places to get shots that aren't already all over Instagram. Last February, I decided to head into the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. I wanted to get some shots of the peaks with fresh snow, specifically around the Alturas lake area. I drove up from Boise and parked my truck at the end of the plowed road near the large wooden Forest Service sign that marks the winter trailhead. There was only one other vehicle there, a white SUV parked near the small shed where they keep the trail maps. I didn't think much of it. It's a popular area for cross-country skiing, so I figured whoever owned the SUV was just out for the day. I loaded up my gear, my camera bag, a sturdy tripod, and my winter camping kit, and started hiking in on snowshoes. I hiked for about 3 hours. The sun was starting to get low, which is exactly what I wanted for the lighting. About 4 miles in, I crested a small ridge and looked down into a clearing near a frozen creek. I saw 2 bright orange tents set up. They were high-end, 4-season tents, the kind you buy at the big outdoor gear warehouse with the green and white logo. I also saw a thin wisp of smoke coming from a stone fire ring. My first thought was that I'd have to find a different spot to camp. I don't really like camping right next to other people when I'm out for photography. I walked down towards the clearing, thinking I'd just say hi and ask how the trail was further up. As I got closer, I noticed something weird. There were no tracks in the snow around the tents except for some very faint, half-filled-in prints that looked like they were a few days old. But the fire was definitely going. I stopped about 20 feet away and called out a hello. No one answered. I walked a bit closer. The camp was perfectly set up. There were 2 camp chairs unfolded by the fire. A cast-iron skillet was sitting on a grate over the embers, and I could actually see steam rising from it. I looked inside the skillet and saw what looked like pieces of salt pork or thick bacon. It was sizzling. Not a lot, but enough that it had clearly just been put there. I called out again, louder this time. I thought maybe they were nearby getting water, or scout style, doing their business in the woods. I waited for about 10 minutes, just standing there in my snowshoes. Nobody came. I checked the tents. I didn't open them, because that's a jerk move, but I tapped on the fabric of the nearest one. It felt empty. The wind caught the flap, and I could see inside for a second. There was a sleeping bag spread out and a backpack sitting in the corner. The fire was what really bothered me. I've spent a lot of time outdoors, and fires don't just stay hot on their own. Someone had to have fed it. I looked at the woodpile next to the fire ring. It was a neat stack of split pine. I reached out my hand toward the stones of the fire ring. They were hot. I could feel the heat radiating off the embers. I decided to wait. I figured they'd be back in a few minutes. I sat down on a fallen log about 50 feet away, where I had a good view of the camp and the surrounding woods. I took out a granola bar and watched. The sun went down behind the peaks, and the temperature started dropping fast. In that part of Idaho, once the sun is gone, it hits sub-zero pretty quickly. After 30 minutes, it was getting dark. I pulled out my headlamp. I looked back at the camp. The skillet was gone. I blinked and shined my light directly at the fire ring. The grate was still there, but the skillet wasn't on top of it anymore. It was sitting on the ground next to one of the camp chairs. I hadn't heard a sound. No footsteps in the snow, no metal clinking on stone. Nothing. I got up and walked over, feeling a bit confused. Maybe I had just misremembered where it was. but I was sure it was on the fire. I looked at the skillet. The bacon was gone. The pan was still warm to the touch, and there was a thin layer of grease at the bottom that hadn't turned white and solid yet. It takes almost no time for grease to solidify in that kind of cold. I started feeling a little bit of a knot in my stomach. I'm not a jumpy person, and I don't believe in anything supernatural, but the math wasn't adding up. I looked for tracks again. The only tracks in the fresh dusting of snow from the afternoon were my own. There were no boots, no snowshoes, and no animal tracks around that skillet. I decided I wasn't going to hike back in the dark. It's too easy to lose the trail or twist an ankle on a hidden rock. I moved about 100 yards away, up a small incline where I could still see the orange tents through the trees, and set up my own camp. I didn't light a fire. I just ate some cold jerky, crawled into my sleeping bag, and kept my headlamp within reach. I couldn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a small sound. Not a scary sound, just normal camping noises. The zip of a tent, the clink of a coffee pot, the sound of a log being tossed onto a fire. Every time I heard something, I'd sit up and peek out the door of my tent. Around 10 p.m., I looked out and saw the fire in the clearing was much brighter. Someone had clearly added wood to it. I could see the orange glow reflecting off the trees. I grabbed my binoculars. I always carry a small pair for scouting locations, and looked down at the camp. The two camp chairs were moved. They were now facing each other across the fire. A few minutes ago, they had both been facing the creek. There was a blue enameled coffee pot sitting on the grate now. I watched it for a solid 5 minutes. I didn't see a single person. I didn't see a hand reach out to move the pot. I didn't see the snow compress under the weight of an invisible body. The pot was just there. Then, while I was looking through the lenses, the pot tipped up, as if someone was pouring a drink into a mug. I couldn't see a mug. I just saw the pot tilt, stay there for 3 seconds, and then set itself back down on the grate. I put the binoculars down and rubbed my eyes. I thought maybe it was some kind of visual trick caused by the heat haze of the fire, or just my brain being tired. I'm 26, I have 20/20 vision, and I don't do drugs. I was stone cold sober. I stayed awake for most of the night. It was the same thing every hour or so. The camp gear was just living. At one point, one of the tent flaps unzipped, stayed open for a minute, and then zipped back up. I saw a pair of boots that had been sitting by the fire suddenly appear under the vestibule of the second tent. I never saw them move. It was like looking at a series of still photos where things just changed between frames. I kept trying to think of a logical explanation. Maybe there was some kind of carbon monoxide leak from my own small stove, even though I hadn't used it much. Or maybe the altitude was getting to me, though 7,000 feet isn't usually enough to cause hallucinations. I even thought about the possibility of some kind of elaborate prank. But who would spend their night in sub-zero temperatures in the middle of a national forest just to move a coffee pot when a stranger was watching? And how were they doing it without leaving tracks? When the first light of dawn started hitting the peaks, I packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking a bit, mostly from the cold, but also because I just wanted to be gone. Before I left, I walked back down to the clearing one last time. The fire was down to white ash. The two orange tents were gone. I don't mean they were packed up. I mean the spot where they had been was just flat snow. There were no tent stake holes. There were no rectangular impressions where the floor of the tents had been. The fire ring was still there, but it looked old. The stones were covered in a thick layer of frost and old grey lichen. There were no embers. There was no split wood. I walked over to where I had seen the skillet and the chairs. Nothing. Just undisturbed snow. I looked for my own tracks from the evening before. I could see where I had walked up to the fire ring and where I had stood by the log. But the tracks I had seen earlier, the half-filled ones, were gone too. I hiked back to the trailhead in record time. I didn't stop to take any photos. When I got to the parking area, the white SUV was gone. The snow around where it had been parked was smooth, like no one had been there in days. I drove back to the small town of Stanley and stopped at the small diner with the peeling white paint and the neon open sign. I ordered a coffee and sat there for an hour, just trying to process it. I thought about asking the waitress if anyone had gone missing lately, but I didn't want to sound like a crazy person. Hey, I saw some ghost tents that moved their own coffee pots. Isn't a great conversation starter? I've looked at the photos I took that evening. I have a few shots of the clearing from when I first arrived. In the photos, you can clearly see the orange tents and the smoke. You can see the skillet on the fire. They're real. I have the digital files with the metadata. I've gone back and forth on what happened. My best guess is that I found some kind of echo of a previous camp. Maybe the atmospheric conditions, the extreme cold, the stillness, the specific humidity somehow recorded a night that happened weeks or years ago. I've heard people talk about stone tape theory, where minerals in the ground can record events, though I always thought that was just something people said to explain away hauntings. The other possibility is that I just had a very specific, very localized mental break. But the photos are there. The orange tents are in the raw files on my hard drive. I haven't gone back to Alturas Lake since then. I still do photography, but I've been sticking closer to the more established trails in the foothills near Boise. There's something about the silence of the deep woods in winter that I don't trust anymore. It felt like I was watching a movie that didn't know I was in the theater. And I really don't want to know what happens if the movie starts noticing the audience. Anyway, I'm putting this here just to see if anyone else has had something similar happen in the Sawtooths. It's a big area, and I can't be the only one who's seen something like that. Honestly, I'm just hoping someone tells me there's a perfectly normal weather phenomenon that explains why a coffee pot would pour itself a drink in the middle of the night. Though, even if they did, I'm not sure I'd believe them.